about what the role of epistemic virtue as a kind of character trait could be, which I'll talk about as the kind of informational commons that we all share. And then I'm really going to ask you to jump in and discuss. So please do kind of get ready to jump in to think about how we might respond to the problem, perhaps given that analogy. What can we do in response to this alleged crisis? And what should we do, or what ought we to do? What are we required to do? So let's start with the diagnosis bit. Why might we think there is a misinformation crisis? And what is the nature of this problem? So as a starting point, I actually want you all to type something into the chat, but don't submit anything just yet. I'm hoping that we'll all be able to submit it together so we don't influence each other's answers, just to kind of get a straw poll about what people think about this topic when they hear the term misinformation. So if you all just wouldn't mind taking a moment and typing into the chat, whatever it is that you think of when you hear the term misinformation, what topic first comes to mind, but don't submit it just yet. Wait until everyone's had a chance to type something in. And then when I give you the signal, we'll all hit submit together. So what's the first topic that comes to mind when you hear the term misinformation? All right, hopefully everyone had a chance to get at least 1 or 2 words down. So on the count of 3, I'm gonna ask us all to hit submit. So 1, 2, 3. All right, go. All right, great. So let's look at some of the topics here. So some things I'm seeing are journalism, sensationalism, quite a few mentions of COVID, Trump and his followers, conspiracy theories, how facts and data are interpreted by others, climate denialism, social media, hydroxychloroquine is also related to COVID-19, evidence, politics, the absence of facts, elections, fake news, war, fake news during the last presidency, Russian influence. So we see a lot of common themes here, right? It seems like the pandemic and COVID-19 really seems to be one topic that comes to mind when we think about misinformation. We also see a lot of political topics, perhaps including the pandemic, but also the concerns about foreign influence, the war, politics in general. There also was a lot of discussion of fake news in the chat there. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of take these all as inputs, and we'll all be able to kind of have something to say about some of these topics by the end of this hour discussion. And I'll keep these kinds of topics in mind as we go through. Okay, so I think when you kind of type in misinformation just to look at different news headlines across different platforms, you'll see a lot of the same kinds of terms that you all brought up. We see a lot of discussion of COVID-19 in the past few years. In the past few weeks, we see a lot of references to the war in Ukraine, also concerns about climate denialism. And so, you're very much kind of have your fingers on the pulse of the kinds of uses of this term we see in the broader public discussion. So a couple of the comments mentioned fake news. I think that's a good starting point because it is something that comes up for a lot of folks when they think about misinformation. And there's been some work in philosophy that tries to analyze the concept. So here's a starting point from Regina Rini. And she gives us a 3-part analysis of what a fake news story is. She says, first, a fake news story purports to describe events in the real world, typically by mimicking the conventions of traditional media. So we have at least a kind of surface level similarity to traditional news sources, and we're at least presenting the story as trying to describe the real world. However, unlike traditional media, Rini suggests, a fake news story is also known by its creators to be significantly false. So what does she mean by that? Well, there's always can be mistakes. There's always some risk of error. So you might think that just it merely being false isn't enough. Traditional media might have this problem. But in the case of a fake news story, those who are putting it out there know that what they're putting out there is very unlikely to be true. And then lastly, she says something about the goals that the people who put the fake news story out there have. And that's part of what makes it fake news. So it's transmitted with the 2 goals of being widely retransmitted and of deceiving at least some of its audience. So there's an intent to deceive others and also to kind of spread throughout a broader social network. And she thinks these are all kind of core components of what it means to have a fake news story. And you'll see, if you just look at advertisements or if you scroll through social media, you'll see a lot of these stories come up. And they often try to get that goal of being widely retransmitted by hooking into some existing interest. They might talk about celebrities or a controversial political figure and have a surprising claim that draws you to click on it because of the novelty or because of your outrage, etc. Now, some scholars who work on this worry that fake news stories, especially online, pose a problem because of the nature of testimony. So when we talk about testimony, what I'm referring to there is just when we learn from the statements of others. We hear others make claims and we learn from those claims. And we all rely on this to a very large degree, just because we can't always make inferences based on directly perceiving some evidence or conducting our own investigation. We're always relying on others telling us about the way the world is. So here's just a mundane example. Imagine you're on your way to the post office and you pass by your neighbor who warns you that they were just there and there was a very, very long line. On the basis of this testimony that there's this very long line at the post office, you might just decide to wait until tomorrow. Now, you haven't directly gone to the post office yourself. You, in most cases, probably wouldn't even bother doing any further cross-checking. You would just trust that your neighbor is telling you the truth about the matter. And so you learn something about the state of the post office based on this claim that someone else gives you. And we typically don't go about our day assuming everyone we try to communicate with is out to deceive us. Instead, we tend to assume a kind of cooperation in our communication. Now, we have certain norms with testimony that might involve a certain kind of tendency to trust others that we just encounter, but we do have cases where we distrust others. We usually appeal to a particular motive. So for example, you might distrust a used car salesperson because they have a motive to try to get you to buy a particular car, especially one that's hard to sell. And we also have norms that allow us to hold others accountable when they do mislead us. So we might hold friends who repeatedly lie to us accountable, perhaps by warning others in our social network or even ending the friendship. So it seems like we're doing something wrong in the practice of testimony, of telling other statements about the way the world is, if we're constantly misleading others, and we can expect to face some repercussions, even if it's just with regard to our reputation. Now, one challenge online, especially using social media platforms, is that information can spread really, really quickly. So one example that gets brought up a lot is this influential study out of MIT using a big amount of Twitter data. And they found that false news stories tended to spread more quickly and penetrated social networks more deeply, with more and more retweets reaching more users than true news stories did. And one explanation they mention is that false news stories tend to be more novel. So if we're trying to get to the facts at first, we might have lots of different traditional news sources all converge on pretty similar stories. But fake news stories, are especially trying to get people to click on them and trying to deceive others and get retransmitted quickly, can have really novel elements. And that attracts clicks, attracts retweets, and it can quickly move through the network. And so it becomes much harder for us to maintain those existing norms of cooperating to try to learn about the way the world is. And when we even have a reason to distrust, to try to verify them, because the fake news stories move through our network so quickly online. Another challenge that some point out is that our norms of testimony, of assuming a tendency to cooperate, when we determine that we need to distrust others, how we go about doing it, holding others accountable, they're less clear in the online domain as compared to other traditional forms of communication. So some examples that some people that have brought up about unclear norms. So one question is, do retweets on Twitter count as endorsements? If this were clear, it probably wouldn't be the case that so many people would include this in their social media biographies. We see it all the time, it's ubiquitous. So we don't know how to treat retweets. In addition, you might worry, does sharing a news article suggest that you endorse its content? The way that if you repeat a claim, you might be suggesting that you think it's true. And even more complicated, when you share a news article online, do you want to suggest that you trust the author or the publication as a source? And then others who might take that to be true might then trust that source for other information that you haven't even looked at. So there's kind of more information being conveyed, perhaps, about what you want to claim or endorse than you might intend. And then lastly, it's not clear if we should be held accountable for the news and sources that we share online, in the same way that we might be held accountable when we mislead our friends and say false things, and others kind of get upset with us and it hurts our reputation. It's not clear we have the same expectations online. So I want to pause here and just see what you all think about this as a kind of starting point. Do you agree that the norms regarding sharing news online are unclear? And whether you think that's true or not, how do you personally decide what to post or share and what not to post or share, perhaps given some of these concerns about misinformation? So I would be very happy to see some comments in the chat, but also if anyone wants to jump in, and you could use the raise hand function and speak orally too, that would be great. I'm interested in hearing a couple of thoughts on these questions. Yes, V, go ahead. Or Dr. Reader.
You're muted. Thanks. Yeah, I think the norms the norms are clear, or perhaps my gut instinct is that there are different norms that apply in this situation and not the ones we're looking for. So the norm might be, I'm going to share something that has a lot of likes because I want other people to repost things that I post, as opposed to having to do with the content of the article. But I think insofar as that there are norms that deal with the content of whatever it is that you're sharing, I think indeed those are unclear.
Thanks. Yeah. So you might think part of what's going on is we just have really different motivations in the online domain, especially given the kinds of information that's most visible to us, indicators of popularity, like you mentioned. And then that might make it more complicated to figure out our kind of realistic expectations for what others are going to do. If this information about popularity is bombarding us in the online domain, the number of comments, the number of likes, it's going to be hard to ignore that as a kind of motivation and expectation for what others are going to do. So thanks. That's a really good point. We want to be realistic about our expectations, and our norms might be sensitive to those. I'm also seeing a lot of comments in the chat that suggest that there's a lot of uncertainty. Some, like David Cassidy, have mentioned that they want to have a clear line that a retweet is an endorsement, but it's not clear if others share that view. Others, like Taylor Wood, have suggested that maybe there's a more permissible view about sharing or reposting without additional commentary as just a kind of amount of agreement, but that there's some level of dispute there. So it seems like at the very least, we have a lot of comments suggesting there's some lack of clarity here, which poses a problem for us. Perhaps it's more difficult to determine how we should interpret others' claims, others' forms of sharing information in this online domain. Also, Liam Conway raises an interesting point that we should consider going forward too, which is that it really depends whether you're using social media for political purposes or not. So if there's a small group of people who are posting lots and lots of political content, that might influence the kinds of political content that we tend to see. And if you're not looking out for that information, the considerations you introduce for what you want to retweet might be less important because you're not thinking about really high stakes decisions. And then you're also not going to be putting your views out there. So we have a selection for who's going to be presenting information. And also Elizabeth Vermillion raises a kind of concern, a personal concern, that she worries that it might just be really difficult to figure out whether something's misinformation or not. And so that leads to a kind of anxiety about what to post, whether to share something or not. And that might be heightened if we're not sure how others are going to interpret this sharing. What kind of agreement do we want to suggest here? Is agreement with the content? Do we want to endorse the author? Do we want to endorse the source? So it sounds like a lot of you see this as a big problem. So I think that's definitely part of the story. And some of you have raised that the political variable, whether the news is political, is a really important consideration. I want to kind of dig into that a bit more. So we might think fake news is especially troubling when it comes to the political domain. And so here's one example of a view that tries to focus on fake news when it comes to politics. They suggest that fake news is actually a feature of institutions, like particular news media organizations, for example. And like Rini, Aiken and Talise suggest that fake news involves posing as journalistic, having this veneer of being like typical media sources. But the difference is that they try to design information to codify and feed on the antecedent biases we have of a pre-selected audience. So the idea is we have all kinds of ways where we try to interpret information that are going to lead us astray from trying to have an accurate view of the world. And fake news institutions in the political domain try to prey on those biases, prey on those tendencies that we have because we're vulnerable to ultimately drive us toward a particular political objective. Maybe it's a matter of deceiving us or trying to convince us of a particular political position to support, but they seem to think the political domain poses an especially big challenge here because there's this vulnerability we have when it comes to politics, that we have these biases. And this is further amplified by some broader social phenomena we see offline too. Some political scientists have suggested that we're in this period of social sorting in the US, where we're not just divided with regard to partisanship, but this division with regard to partisanship has aligned with other really important social divisions like race and religion. And so we're increasingly sorted along one dimension that aligns with our partisanship, with our racial identity, with our religious practices and identity. And furthermore, we see this playing out spatially. So there's some recent work suggesting that we have increasing amounts of partisan sorting residentially where we live. And it's not fully explained by ethnic and racial segregation. There's further segregation even on the level of particular cities and particular neighborhoods, where particular partisan identities will tend to lead you to live in one area and not another. And so we end up increasingly living very different social lives. We attend different religious services, we tend to shop at different stores, we take part in different dating pools, and we come to distrust those who are seen as part of an outgroup, whether it's because of race, religion, partisanship, or some other aligned identity, where we wouldn't want to kind of see other members of our family be part of that group. We wouldn't want to date someone like that. We just have this kind of social separation, which can amplify this vulnerability we have to have biased responses to political information. And so I think this leads to a different kind of misinformation that should also be considered part of the misinformation crisis. We're not just misinformed with regard to particular kinds of scientific topics, for example, like related to the pandemic or related to climate change. We're also misinformed about one another. And this in part helps to explain why we're so vulnerable to those other particular scientific or technical forms of misinformation. So here's just an illustrative example. This political science study from 2018 looked at perceptions of partisan groups based on salient subgroups. So they had people estimate, how many Democrats, how many Republicans are members of this particular subgroup. And in general, they found that especially members of the outgroup, so Democrats assessing Republicans and vice versa, tended to vastly overestimate the share of partisans that took part in that particular subgroup. So for example, Republicans tended to overestimate the share of Democrats who belong to a labor union or atheist or agnostic, and Democrats tended to overestimate the share of Republicans who make over $250,000 per year or who are age 65 or older. So we have these kinds of stereotypes of what these partisan groups look like, and they have a kernel of truth given this increasing form of sorting. But then we actually don't really understand what the makeup of these kind of perceived outgroups really looks like. We tend to overestimate based on those associations we have. And this is kind of further amplified by all these what we might call filtering effects. So we're not just wrong about the composition of these groups, but we also have a harder time understanding their perspectives and what the kinds of claims that they're going to find convincing really look like. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So we face filtering with regard to our exposure of views outside of our own network, because what's most entertaining or most outlandish, as some of your comments about norms of social media suggested, get the most attention. So we're most likely to see views from members of our outgroup when they're especially entertaining or outlandish, but those may not be representative of what most members of the group actually think or what the best arguments are in favor of their preferred policies. So you might see this a lot when you are searching online on YouTube, for example, or on TikTok. You'll see viral videos with these all caps headlines about exposing some particular person, like exposing college liberal with facts and logic or something like that, right? And the arguments that are going to be raised by the outgroup in those videos are going to be ones that are entertaining or outlandish to show the outgroup as being stupid or silly, but may not really put us in a good position to be able to understand how people who are part of that group are actually reasoning about these issues. We're also limited in our exposure to the forms of diversity outside of our own group. So remember, we were misinformed about the composition of the groups. We may miss really important forms of diversity. So we saw this, for example, in some of the discussions about the 2020 election, when there were some surprise in some corners of the media about the percentages of Asian American Pacific Islander voters and Hispanic Latino voters who voted for Trump. So for example, people who aren't part of those broad communities may not have a sense of the important political differences between people of different national origins. So Vietnamese Americans versus Chinese Americans versus Japanese Americans, or Mexican Americans versus Cuban Americans, and what part of the country they're in. So it's often easier when you're part of the group to see that form of diversity and see why it's politically important, but we're not always exposed to it as we're socially sorted. And then lastly, we also impose these filtering effects on ourselves with how we engage information. So you may have heard of the phenomena of confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. We tend to pay more attention to pieces of evidence when they tend to confirm our pre-existing worldview, our pre-existing commitments. And we're motivated to counter-argue and reject information that we encounter that challenges it. So we don't always learn about information that seems to challenge our pre-existing commitments. And so we don't bring it on as part of our view of what others in the outgroup look like, furthering this misinformation. So ultimately, I think we could summarize this broader misinformed about one another problem as being a challenge of a kind of friends and enemies mindset. Under the conditions that I've just described, we come to see the political domain as a contest between our friends and enemies, where we want to approach politics as an opportunity to cheer on our friends and secure victories against our enemies, signal our loyalty or our commitment to those who are on our chosen side, without necessarily emphasizing that motivation we have to learn accurately about the way the world is and learn accurately about these other citizens that we have to make decisions with sometimes. And so all of this contributes to entrenching the forms of misunderstanding that get targeted with fake news, and also the kind of background misunderstanding of one another. So the kind of summary here is the misinformation crisis is certainly in part driven by the influence of fake news, as many of you pointed out in your initial chat comments, But I think we can't properly understand this threat without also paying attention to how we are misinformed and fail to communicate with one another, given these broader concerns and this friends and enemies mindset we take on. Okay, so that's some discussion of the diagnosis. Let me present a kind of analogy to you, and then I'm going to ask you to comment on some particular cases to think about more thoroughly. So here's an analogy from the environmental domain. There's this term, the tragedy of the commons, that describes this problem that comes about when we have a shared common resource that no one lays ownership to. So imagine you share a pond with your neighbors, and as long as each of you takes only one fish from the pond each day, the fish population will remain stable. So there's a steady supply of fish for you to take to eat in the future because the fish can repopulate. But you have no means of ensuring that your neighbors who also have access to the pond will also only take one fish per day. And if others start to take more than one fish, the fish supply will eventually dwindle because it can't replenish fast enough to keep the population up. So if you think that's going to be the case and you start to distrust your neighbors, it may be individually rational for you to take more than one fish per day, but then over time, this leaves fewer fish total and potentially no fish as the cycle continues. So the problem we face in the tragedy of the commons, which is why it's a tragedy, is that by acting in our individual self-interest, trying to look out for ourselves and get the fish before others take them all, we're all collectively left worse off because our fish supply, which would have been sustainable, is just completely lost. Well, you see the same kind of dynamic play out in other phenomena like in pollution and traffic during rush hour, where we all want to take the highway at the same exact time. We're all left worse off in really bad traffic. So we might think a similar problem is what we face with regard to misinformation in the kind of shared informational space we all have, whether it's online or in our discussions in person. We have individual motivations to sometimes act in ways that can pollute this informational environment, signaling our loyalty, making members of the outgroup look silly or stupid, making ourselves feel like we're winning, and even spreading misinformation to perhaps convince others to join our side or be worried about a particular policy that we also are worried about. And this might even make sense in some contexts. It can be individually rational. But over time, as we continue to act these ways, it might start to leave us all worse off because we're in a worse position to be able to learn and communicate one another. We all take on this friends and enemies mindset, and we don't have this shared space to learn and reason. And so luckily, the traditional solutions to the tragedy of the commons aren't the only possible solutions here. There's an array of options. So the traditional solutions suggest that you need some kind of external intervention. The people who are sharing the pond, for example, won't be able to sort it out for themselves. So you either need the state to come in and take ownership of the pond and regulate who can use it when, or you need to subdivide it into private property so that each person takes control of the particular component they share. But this Nobel Prize-winning economist, Elinor Ostrom, in this book from the 1990s, argued that these aren't the two only options. When she looked at how particular small communities actually governed common resources sustainably, they don't necessarily rely on the state externally coming in to control the resource or individual private property subdivision. Instead, she finds that communities were able to develop their own forms of self-governance by investing time and resources into particular norms and rules that could determine who could use what when. So here's an example. She talks about this fishery in Turkey where you have all these small fishermen who use boats. And at first they were all competing for the prime spots during the right time of the year, which led to over harvesting and also fighting where no one got to use the spot sometimes. And so they were all left worse off, threatening the sustainability of the fish supply and also not getting as many fish as they otherwise would have. But the fishers were able to come together and through a local cooperative came up with new rules to allocate fishing sites. So they created a list of who was eligible to use the fishing locations. They created a kind of initial random assignment and set up a system where everyone rotated each day and moved to a different spot so that everyone knew that they would be able to share equally in the prime spots eventually. And they had a system to monitor themselves because if you knew you were going to have the prime spot that day, you had a reason to come early and make sure that someone else wasn't using it. So the lesson here that Ostrom tells us is that the fishers in this community didn't just devote their efforts to securing as many fish for themselves, like we saw in the tragedy of the commons case. They also invested some of their time and resources into maintaining the common resource and setting up this system that allowed them to do so. So this violated the kind of assumption that suggested we only could solve the problem with external intervention. And you might think what I'm calling epistemic virtue could kind of serve a similar role for us in the information commons. If this analogy holds, we might ask, how might we contribute to the better maintenance of our shared informational environment, much like the fishers in Turkey were able to maintain and self-govern with regard to the fish supply? And one potential answer is that we can develop and exercise certain virtues that are conducive to contributing to a healthier informational environment. When I talk about virtues here, I just mean a kind of tendency to think and act in a certain way, especially in a way that's kind of excellent or beneficial in some way and is cultivated through our habits. So in particular, you might think of epistemic virtues as tendencies that help us to become better knowers and reasoners. So this might include things like being open-minded, being curious about the truth, being humble, so you don't have your beliefs outstrip your evidence. And these are all dispositions that might make us better knowers and learners. But given the nature of the misinformation crisis, where we're misinformed about one another and often fail to communicate at a social level, we might also have to extend our conception about what these tendencies should be. So also think about how we're influencing one another, how we're all dependent on one another, and not just our individual knowledge, our individual beliefs. And so far as we all benefit from a healthy informational environment, we might have a responsibility to try to cultivate virtues that can help us to maintain it. So, okay, now let's think about how we might respond to the problem, given this analogy, if you find it compelling. So let me give you an example. So take a moment just to soak it in, and then I'll invite you all to share either via the chat or orally what you think about the case. So we have this person, Marisol. She opens Twitter on her phone. She's just scrolling through, and she sees that a few of her friends have tweeted about their disappointment over a decision that was just made by her local city council. This is the first time she's hearing about this decision, but she's generally been upset with many of the decisions made by the current mayoral administration and the city council. So just given what's been described here, I want to ask what you would recommend Marisol should do. So first, I want to ask what information is missing from this description that would be important for making a recommendation. I've purposely left it at a kind of pretty general level, but we might ask, what else would you need to know to be able to advise Marisol? And then I also want to ask, how might Marisol learn about the decision? And should she post about the decision too? Or do you think that she has some further responsibility before she can go ahead and post? What do we think about this? How would you advise Marisol in this situation? So Venus has mentioned in the chat that she needs to go to a sound source to verify. So it sounds like Venus Kent's view is that we have some kind of responsibility. We can't just post about a particular policy decision that our friends are upset about without investigating through some other more reliable source. That's one view you might have. We need to be constantly cross-checking. But notice that's different from the example we talked about where we were deciding whether to go to the post office based on what our neighbor said. It seems like we have some heightened responsibility in this case, at least if Venus Kent's view is correct. I'm seeing a couple other views in the chat, and just keep them coming, or if you want to explain it via audio, that's great too. So Mukul Sharma mentions that perhaps Marisol should try to see where the tweet came from, and then whether it's a news article or reporter. And Taylor Wood mentions that the rationale behind the decision would be important. So maybe it's not just about verifying, but it's also certain kinds of information that Marisol needs to be able to responsibly post about it. In particular, she needs to know something about the reasoning that the decision makers in the city council had, and then maybe she's allowed to post. That's an interesting thought. Thanks, Taylor. We have a couple of other views about checking the source. So it seems like many of you think that's a kind of responsibility. Vanessa Carbonell mentions that perhaps Marisol could be able to post about it if her friends are very, very reliable. So imagine perhaps that the friends she's seeing post about it are people who work really closely with the city council, are really committed activists in this particular issue. Maybe that's a case, given Vanessa Carbonell's reasoning, that she actually could just post because they are kind of equivalent to a trusted news source or a trusted expert. Okay, so I'm also interested to hear what you all think about whether the responsibility she has differs depending on whether she posts her own message or her own commentary on Twitter, or if she's just retweeting one of her friends. Many of you before mentioned that you thought that it's often assumed that retweets involve some kind of endorsement. And typically we don't want to just say things when we have no basis for formulating the judgment we have in typical conversation. Maybe that's different online. So do these kind of due diligence constraints apply just as well, just as much if she's just retweeting what her friends have said? So one thought you might have, oh yeah, go ahead. Dr. Carlson.
I was gonna, as someone organizing this session, I call on myself. I wanted to, it's an interesting question. So let me the question was just clarity. Do the due diligence constraints apply equally between the two options where tweeting, like retweeting what my friends post versus me posting something original, right? Was that the question?
Exactly. So you might want to contribute to the discussion with your own thoughts. So it'd be your own post, or it might just be you retweeting what your friend have said.
Okay. But I'm like commenting on their thing as opposed to, but it's still engaging the original tweet. It's not me just writing up my own post, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that's a little different than I was thinking. I feel more of an obligation to fact check if I'm writing something very original as opposed to retweeting what my friends post. But on that question, I feel like if I just comment on it, I don't think I've endorsed it as much as like if I have retweeted it. So if I just retweet and move on, as opposed to engage, yeah, I guess it depends on the nature of my comment, but it seems a little less it seems less of an endorsement if all I'm doing is commenting.
Yeah, so on your view, Dr. Carlson, it sounds like you think that actually in some cases, the standards for due diligence for a retweet might be even higher than offering our own commentary. Maybe part of what you have in mind is we can properly calibrate how confident we are, what the basis of our comments is if we're saying something in our own words, versus when we're retweeting, that signal is very, very coarse-grained. It's just us repeating what someone has said. And it's not clear how much we've actually looked into it ourselves. Is that part of what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think so. Or retweeting does feel like I'm saying this thing is true. Whereas if I just say, oh my gosh, I can't believe they did that on a comment, I don't think I'm necessarily, that's not an intentional decision to broadcast it to other people. So I feel like something feels less burdensome on me if I'm just commenting. I don't know how to quite articulate it, but that's where my intuitions lie right now.
Interesting. Yeah. So if you're just commenting on a thread that someone else has started, one of your friends, you might think that's more just like responding to someone in a conversation. And in typical conversations, we don't think we have a really, really strong view to withhold any response and then having to go and search things before we can do that. So you might think that the commenting option is actually more analogous to just a kind of initial response. But then when we start to post our own, we start to retweet something and amplify the particular claim someone's making, maybe it's more like repeating a claim out in public to other people who weren't there for the original claim. And that starts to look more like a due diligence requirement, perhaps. And we're seeing a couple of other comments in the chat kind of adding on to this point. So Dominic Antaki notes that they think that Marisol should try to get the background info on the decision before taking any action, because a lot of people post the general obvious information without discussing it and discussing what's going on behind the scenes. So they think it's a responsibility and requirement to fact check everything before commenting. So they have a slightly stronger view about the requirements. Now, if we were to take on this view, we would be commenting less often, just given limited time constraints. You might think that's a good thing just because of the sheer amount of traffic, but you might also think that you lose out on that opportunity to share in that initial response that Dr. Carlson was mentioning too. Sophia Payton also mentions an interesting point, which is that Marisol has to take responsibility because of the way that her name and identity are attached to what she's saying. And she also has a kind of responsibility not to just engage emotionally. So perhaps some of those kind of off the cuff responses that we thought had a greater due diligence might also be things we don't want to post publicly in the social media sphere because they might have a different kind of influence than just an initial oral response in an ongoing conversation. So you've all highlighted, I think, a lot of really interesting variables that make this transfer between our norms and expectations from in-person conversations or one-on-one conversations to the social media sphere much more complicated. We don't have the same kinds of privacy, we don't have the same kinds of publicity, and the same kinds of information about what we're saying aren't always transmitted, whether something's an off-the-cuff response or a kind of considered public judgment. And so maybe it's kind of incumbent on us, to Dr. Carlson's point, to try to be more clear about what the kind of comment we're trying to make. Is this something that's an off-the-cuff response? We could say that at the start of our post, at the start of our comment, versus a considered judgment that we want to reflect based on particular reasons we have. And many of you suggested that the reasons behind a decision were really important to investigate. So maybe those are also important considerations to try to include in our own comments. Okay, so let's talk about one other case. So instead of Marisol, we have Nick now. So Nick is, and this is an in-person example rather than an online one. So we might think about how this changes our judgments about the case. So Nick is on his way home from work when he passes by a few people holding signs with slogans that he completely disagrees with. And he thinks stem from a complete misunderstanding of the current immigration refugee policy. Let's say this is in the US. He's surprised and offended to see people in his own neighborhood with these signs expressing these views. Now, he has seen these views before. His uncle, who he usually vehemently disagrees with when it comes to politics, has forwarded him similar perspectives on immigration and refugee policy using WhatsApp, a kind of direct messaging app that also involves a lot of political discussion. But he usually just deletes these messages that get forwarded to him. They're kind of like chain mail, doesn't really read them or engage with his uncle. However, unlike in the case where his uncle sends him online messages, now that these views are being expressed in his own neighborhood, he feels the need to take some action to express his disagreement. So again, I'm interested to hear about what information you think is missing from this description that would be important for making your recommendation. I also want to ask, do you think Nick should change his assessment of his neighborhood based on this experience? Does this provide important evidence about the kind of neighborhood he lives in, about what his neighbors are like? And then with regard to the action, should he confront the people with the signs? And if so, how should he do so? And if not, why not? So what do we think? What information is missing here? How should Nick update his perception of his neighborhood? And should he confront the people with the signs, given this desire he has to express his disagreement? So Sophia Payton notes that it seems important to know what the risks are to Nick. So if it seems like the people that Nick would be confronting are otherwise friendly, maybe he's seen them around the neighborhood before, or they're having a casual conversation, maybe the risks are fairly low, and it seems like a promising situation to express his disagreement and start a conversation. But Sophia suggests a kind of apprehension to be able to engage, and posting about the experience on social media might be a better idea, actually. So if you agree with Sophia or Sophia yourself, I'd be interested to hear why you think posting might be better than confronting the people with the signs in person. And Dominic Antecchi notes that one concern about this scenario might be that Nick might be worried that maybe he's engaging in a kind of friends and enemies mindset, where there's a view that he disagrees with, he's in fact offended by it, and he has this initial motivation to try to express disagreement, respond to it, challenge it, but it may not actually lead to some forms of learning that might be beneficial for him. That's another potential thought. Mukul Sharma mentions that Nick should try to gain a better understanding of why the people holding the signs believe what they believe. So what evidence are they basing their judgments on, and what kinds of values are guiding them? That's a really good thought. Even if he disagrees with them, Mukul thinks, he would at least gain something, a certain kind of better understanding of what they believe, and that might be helpful in guiding discussions. So one reason why you might think Mukul's view could be epistemically helpful, so helpful with regard to our information and our belief formation practices, is that the people in his neighborhood might be easier to communicate with versus people who have different views and are from a totally different area. They at least have some common shared form of understanding, a shared space, kind of shared shorthand, perhaps, if there's kind of local lingo they can use. So it might be easier to learn about the perspective that these people have compared to people who are in a totally different area. Now, you might think Nick already has this opportunity with his uncle. They're from the same family. They might have a shared perspective, shared background, some shared identities. And so maybe that's a kind of comparison to make too. But maybe Mukul's thinking that it's also helpful to talk to someone that we're not too close with. So if this discussion goes poorly, maybe Nick doesn't have to worry about going to family dinners with the person the way he does with his uncle. That's another potential trade-off, especially given the risks that Sophia brought up. David Cassidy also notes that it's important to think about what the motivations for the people protesting might be. And if they're just trying to provoke a confrontation in that neighborhood and they don't actually live there, maybe Nick shouldn't necessarily jump to a conclusion about his neighborhood as having lots of people that share this particular view. And maybe he's better off avoiding confrontation because that will just amplify the perception that other people have of his group as being unable to discuss, etc. Liam Conway notes that they're worried about online spaces being an echo chamber where we're exposed to lots of the same views that we already endorse. And even if that's not necessarily true, you might think because of our motivated reasoning and our tendency to focus on information that's going to affirm our prior commitments, that will still tend to just largely take on information that makes us more confident. And so you might think that posting online about this may not actually have much of an effect. Okay, thanks. So I now want to suggest, I think these are kind of interesting case studies to get some kind of initial responses down about what kinds of responsibilities we think are applying, but I've sort of misled you too. So I think one thing that's tricky about these cases is I've only ever asked you about what the individuals in the case should do, Marisol and Nick. But as I think it was David Cassidy brought up, often what we try to do when we engage in political discussion or take political action in protests is we try to organize groups. And it might be that part of what might be the most virtuous thing to do, what's going to contribute to a healthier environment, is creating new spaces with other people that are kind of better positioned, or in a better position to communicate in, as opposed to just posting to an ongoing disagreement that our friends are making or starting a direct confrontation on the street. So here's some potential examples of things that we might do to kind of create a potentially healthier space. Although you might think these are not promising. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. So one proposal that we sometimes see, in particular, Bradley Crocker brings this up, a psychologist at McGill. So we might try to inoculate ourselves from fake news with very small targeted exposures. So we're in a better position to identify it and try to respond to it. This is not unlike some of the comments that you all made about trying to determine what the motivations of the people protesting were. Were they just out looking for a confrontation or trying to film some video to go viral? Or were they genuinely friendly and open to conversation? Being able to pick up on that might be important in the same ways that when we look at a social media post, picking up on whether it's kind of designed to go viral and deceive us is important to know so we can engage with it appropriately and not attach too much weight to what it's saying. And so an example of this is that there's this online quiz that the Media Forensics Hub at Clemson has produced, a university in South Carolina, where they give you this kind of series of scenarios with these fake social media profiles, and they help you to practice to spot the troll or spot the kind of bad actor spreading fake news. You might think these kinds of designed exposures to what fake news is like leave us in a better position to determine when we should engage, when we should trust, and when we should distrust, given that kind of confusion about what the norms are online. I also mentioned working in groups to create new spaces. So here's one example of that is really interesting. So Dan Kahan, a psychologist at Yale, has talked about the very different kinds of climate action coalitions we've seen in Southeast Florida compared to nationally, where we're kind of in this friends and enemies partisan gridlock over climate change. So he describes how in a couple of counties in Southeast Florida, we see a lot of local stakeholders, local businesses, local elected officials and activists all cooperating to take climate action, signing on and getting local governments to agree to a bunch of different climate policies, including building protection for rising seawaters and attempts to mitigate contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. And what he suggests there is the reason they're able to do this is because they've avoided creating discussions, creating spaces where people think about climate change as a question of whose side they're on, a kind of friends and enemies mindset. And instead, they've cultivated a set of expectations, a set of habits that make it the case that we're instead asking, what do we know about living in a region that's facing a climate threat right now? What are we seeing and how do we respond to it in a kind of shared problem solving? So he notes, for example, that the participants in this kind of regional compact, this group of different stakeholders coming together, include local elected officials who make an effort not to stoke partisan rhetoric to try to secure points in a kind of short-term way, but instead try to affirm a variety of stakeholder values and shutting down partisan rhetoric when it comes about to kind of make clear we have this diverse coalition that we might disagree on lots of things about, but we're trying to kind of gather information about what it's like to live in this region facing this threat and respond to it in ways that we can work together on. So you might think if shifted how we're thinking about engaging in politics, engaging in learning and communicating to make a different kind of collective action possible and govern their informational commons, govern the norms about how they're communicating in the similar way to how the fishers in Turkey govern the rules about how they could take fish out and from which spots. Now you might think, okay, but some political issues are just really, really kind of deep down disagreements. They're really controversial. We shouldn't always be trying to get everyone together in a kind of kumbaya framework. And I think there's a good case to be made for that. But we also can try to exhibit these kinds of virtues, creating opportunities to communicate and learn in a healthier environment, even in circumstances where we're trying to build a coalition that's going to be oppositional, taking on controversial issues, challenging those who we see as creating injustices. So Alicia Garza has a really interesting book, The Purpose of Power. She's one of the founders of Black Lives Matter movement, where she describes the challenges she's experienced as a community organizer in the Bay Area, trying to engage a multiracial coalition to take action in response to shared problems like police violence or environmental threats to public health. She talks about how the different communities she tried to organize had all of these stereotypes and prejudices about what members of other races were like, people living in other neighborhoods were like, not unlike the kinds of misinformation about one another that we see at the national level. And she talks about how she would go knocking on doors, try to recruit people to sign up to take action or meet with one another. And she would hear all of these misinformed judgments or kind of disparaging remarks about members of other races, other ethnicities. And she knows that she doesn't try to shut down the comments. She didn't find that was very effective because people thought you were just trying to tell them they weren't seeing what they did in fact see. Instead, she suggests a kind of virtuous response would be to ask questions in a way that help people to understand what they're seeing. So she gives an example of some Black residents she spoke to who had a disparaging view about Mexicans as being loud and having too many people in one house. And the kinds of questions she would ask in response to those claims would be about why they think so many people live in one house and what they think that must be like, which would often lead to a kind of discussion about immigration policy and why people might be moving to the US and under these conditions. And she suggests that asking questions in this way helps people to reframe what it is they're seeing and build a kind of shared understanding that might then facilitate further communication across racial lines of division. So I think kind of given these examples, we can try to pull some general lessons from them. So if we think these cases are cases of epistemic virtue, of these ways of these tendencies to reason and act in ways that contribute to a healthier informational commons, informational environment, these are 3 lessons we might use to try to build on these cases in our own lives, in our own scenarios that we encounter. So first, we might consider the existing role you have in your network. Where can you serve as a trusted and effective bridge across lines of miscommunication, across lines of division or lack of communication? And what spaces for learning or communication can you actually contribute to make healthier? Some of you suggested that some online spaces or cases where people are not engaging in good faith because they want to spur a viral response may not be ones that are very promising because you don't already have a kind of built-in trust and you don't think you'll be able to make that space healthier. So you might just choose to disengage. But in others, like in the Southeast Florida case from Kahan or in Alicia Garza's community organizing, you might be well positioned to serve as a bridge and provide this form of communication that's not present there. In addition, it seems like in some of these cases, we're learning from diversity. What do others think, including others who are spreading misinformation, like in the inoculation example? And then try to think about what kinds of diversity are others missing because they're not part of your group and they're instead thinking in terms of kind of stereotypes. And then lastly, we learn from the Ostrom example. Try to cultivate what you might call an environmental mindset. Don't just focus on securing your own individual goals, securing victory for your own friends, because over time, if everyone does that, we're all going to be left worse off. Just like when we all try to take as many fish as we want out of the pond, but don't consider what's going to be sustainable. Instead, consider how your discussions, debates, protests, form of organizing are contributing to the overall informational environment and can help to build existing bridges that can then lead to advancing further shared goals. So here I've focused on developing certain kinds of habits and certain kinds of skills. And you might think that's part of the story if you like the analogy to the Ostrom environmental discussion. But you still might think there's some role for regulation. Maybe you think individual skills and habits just aren't going to be enough. So here I want to pause and ask you whether you agree with the proposals and the examples I've given or not. Do you think regulation of social or other forms of media should be used to combat misinformation? And if so, what should that regulation look like? Or do you think really we can rely on these kinds of skills and habits to build healthier spaces to try to combat the problem? Yeah, and Ornaith O'Dowd makes a really important point here. Sometimes signaling is going to be really important for the kinds of political goals and communication we're after. We're not always trying to learn about perspectives that we don't share. Sometimes we want to respond to some threat that we see to members of our community or to other communities that we want to align ourselves with. And so some forms of signaling can be really helpful for political purposes. So we often have to think about what are the trade-offs going to be. So what do we think about regulation? Is there a role for regulation in responding to this misinformation crisis, given that we're misinformed about one another? So Dr. Carbonell in the chat mentions that regulation might be necessary in cases where the stakes of the misinformation are really, really high, and perhaps the effects are really, really urgent. So many of you mentioned COVID-19, for example, as an association you had with misinformation. That's a case where our partisan attachments, perhaps other group attachments we have made us really vulnerable to some kinds of misinformation, at least in some communities. And you might think if the health threat is literally killing people, maybe you need to be able just to shut down the communication. It's just going to keep polluting the informational environment. We need a kind of reset. So that might be one rationale you give for labeling things as misinformation online, or even blocking certain users who are spreading lots of misinformation from continuing to share on the platform. That's one perspective. Mukul Sharma mentioned that there might be a balance of combating misinformation. So there should be some standards for reviewing articles and stories that are being shared to allow for fact checking. But maybe you're not necessarily shutting down all of the contributions to the informational environment. So that's definitely another important thought. You might think that kind of fact checking built into a media platform provides some way to act on those due diligence responsibilities that you all mentioned in regard to Marisol case. So when Marisol sees her friends posting about the city council decision, if there's a mechanism to allow for fact checking directly on the platform, it's much easier for her to then find other sources to consider the reasons behind the decision, whether her friends are reliable or not. If we don't have that, it becomes much more burdensome to try to act on those responsibilities. So maybe that's part of what Mukul has in mind. Liam Conway also mentions that there might be a slippery slope. So you might think it's hard to contain some forms of regulation of online speech, for example, once you start to do it. And maybe you start to limit communication so much that you don't get the kinds of exchange, exposure to diversity that seem to be important for forms of virtue. Taylor Wood mentions, though, that it seems like regulation can't be the full story either. So even if you think some of the explanations that people like Dr. Carbonell and Mukul gave about regulations might contribute to a healthier informational commons, you might think that isn't the only solution, in the same way that just relying on the state to impose regulations or dividing up the pond to private property wasn't going to be the only solution or a sufficient solution in the environmental case from Ostrom. Arnath O'Donnell makes another really, really important point. Sometimes actors don't just have political motivations, they also have financial ones. So there's been some kind of worrisome cases about people who just try to find politically outrageous fake news stories to spread because they generate lots and lots of clicks, and lots of advertising revenue. If that's part of the motivation there, then we need to try to find ways to cordon off actors that are motivated by kind of outrage profits, and instead try to find spaces where people who are engaging in good faith and trying to cultivate these virtues can engage with one another. Okay, so I think we're quickly running out of time. So let me just thank you all for your really great contributions. I think we raised a lot of really interesting points. There were some interesting forms of agreement, both in regards to what you thought about misinformation and your potential views about what our responsibilities are, but also some interesting forms of disagreement, perhaps with regard to how to respond with regard to cultivating virtue and what kinds of regulation are needed. So I just want to highlight the really great slate of events that are coming up. There's one more pre-Ethics Day event on education equity this Thursday at 12 p.m., which I highly recommend. And then there's a full slate of events on March 31st on Ethics Day itself, pretty much from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And you can find all these events on cincyethics.org, and you can register for them there. So thank you everyone for a really great discussion, and hope to continue the conversation in whatever form would be helpful for you all. Thanks.